Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you for being here, taking your lunch time to come and get a little information, to learn a little bit about why it is that we tend to overeat. And so I think this will be an interesting topic for you. It's certainly an interesting thing for me. I'm not an absolute expert in this, but I've been doing a lot of research and some reading and some things about it. And I found it very compelling because it answers a lot of the questions that sometimes we have that, well, why do I? Even sometimes when we don't want to. A lot of the information that we're going to talk about comes from Dr. David Kessler. Dr. David Kessler was the commissioner of the FDA during the 90s, and he was the real big push behind the relabeling of foods, where now we have the labels that give us calories and fat and sugar and all that type of stuff, as well as the ingredients list. He was also one of the individuals who had the real charge against the tobacco industry and all the practices that they used in marketing to people about, although they knew many of the harmful side effects of using cigarettes and other tobacco products. He's currently at the University of California, San Francisco, and in 2009, last year, he released a book called The End of Overeating. And so if you're interested in more information and more detail about this particular topic, it's a really good book, and I would highly recommend that you read it. Another individual that I've read a lot about recently is Dr. Kelly Brown at Yale, and he does some of similar kind of things, but he focuses more upon the food industry and some of their practices that they use in order to get us to eat more things that we shouldn't. And so there's a lot of really compelling things that he talks about, and we'll talk about some of that today too. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to imagine for a second that you've had dinner, and a couple of hours have gone by. You've done whatever you're doing for the evening, whether it's going out in the yard or watching TV or playing with the kids or whatever it is that you've done. You come back inside, and there's a plate of cookies sitting on the table. Some nice chocolate chip cookies. And so you're not really hungry because it hasn't been that long since you ate. So hunger isn't what's driving you to eat that cookie, but you decide to have one. It's no big deal, right? So you have that cookie and it's nice and just right, where it's chewy, not too hard, not too soft, it's warm. Lots of chocolate chips with the little... That's right. You get all the smell and everything, right? So you decide to have one. After you have that cookie, you're still not hungry. But you have another one. You're still not hungry. But you have another one. And another one. And pretty soon, before you realize it, you're saying to yourself, man, why did I eat so many darn cookies? Whether you finish the plate or not, you kind of get upset with yourself. You say, why? Why is it that I had to keep eating those cookies? I wasn't hungry. And so that's really what we're going to explore today. And sometimes we think, well, it's just because you didn't have enough willpower. I'm going to show you that in many cases, it's not just a matter of willpower. There's some actual things going on up here that make it very difficult to say no to certain types of foods. And so that's what we're going to explore. But there's some baseline, some ground level stuff that we need to build upon and to understand a little bit. Then we can have the pieces will fit together to understand this better. First of all is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain. You probably have heard of it. There's a lot of research and even a lot of pharmaceuticals that are towards dopamine these days. And one of the things that dopamine does is it causes us or allows us to focus. Focus on the most important stimuli that's coming in at any given time. Okay? So, if a bear were to walk in the door right now, you would no longer hear a single word I'm saying because dopamine would suddenly cause you to focus on that bear because that's the most important stimuli coming into your world. Okay? If you have to go to work but you have to leave a child at home, you're constantly thinking about that child because dopamine causes you to focus on that. Those types of things. That's what dopamine does. At least one thing it does. It does many things. So it's important to understand that. Well, food is very important to us, isn't it? What's the body's number one priority? Survival. And food's very important to survival. So when we have food, dopamine causes us to focus on that food because that's something that we need. But typically, once we eat the food, then dopamine habituates. In other words, it comes back down, the brain kind of shuts back down, and we don't tend to focus on it any longer. Okay? So that's just kind of, again, kind of a ground level that we want to establish, first of all. Second of all is some chemicals called opioids. I don't know why I always have a hard time saying that. But these are really chemicals that help both reduce pain and help us feel pleasure and even euphoria. They're natural chemicals that are part of us, and it's part of the reward system of the body. When things are pleasurable, then it's rewarding. We feel good, and we want to continue doing those same types of things. Well, when you take things, exogenous things outside the body in that increase the opioids, such as opiates, you've heard of this, right? Then it tends to have very addictive type properties. And it tends to also cause withdrawals if we stop using those particular things. So there's a true connection between dopamine that's elevated, opioids that get elevated, that cause us to feel those pleasure and euphoria type feelings. And one thing although we won't directly make the link to, but you may be able to mentally make the leap to, is that when you look at withdrawal symptoms and addictions with things like alcohol or tobacco or drugs or things like that, and opioids, well, guess what? Food has some very similar effects, at least in terms of certain types of foods, which, again, we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So, I am going to say it out loud, but more of a suggestion that there may be some addictive properties to food behaviors that actually cause withdrawal type symptoms similar to other addictive substances. So, there's nothing out there to absolutely prove that at this point. There's people starting to talk about it, and that's why I say I'm just going to suggest that possibly that's true. Okay? Well, we talked about that. The next thing we need to talk about a little bit is the amygdala. The amygdala is a little part of the brain that's really responsible for memories of emotion. And so when you have emotions that are connected with certain events or certain circumstances, those memories of those emotions get stored in the amygdala. And that's really important to understand because typically, if we have emotions around eating and around food, or the environments of food and that type of stuff, typically once we eat the food, the amygdala, it lets down, it habituates. And that's a good thing. But for many, the amygdala is really hypersensitive. It gets actually trained, or it learns, which we're going to talk about some more. It actually learns some things where it becomes overstimulated, and simply having the food item doesn't cause it to habituate. What's really interesting is what does cause it to habituate. Anybody want to take a guess? What deactivates it? The very thing that's so hard to do. Actually stopping. You know, when we get into this condition, it actually becomes very difficult to stop. But that's the very thing that causes the amygdala to finally calm back down so that the emotions aren't driving the desire or the crave.